some of the traditional definitions of computer security and how our definitions for semantic or cognitive hacking fit into those. So Dorothy Denning wrote a book a few years ago on information warfare, focused more on sort of economics rather than military kind of information warfare, just general everyday society. And she described perception management as information operations that aim to affect the perceptions of others in order to influence their emotions, reasonings, decisions, and ultimately actions. So you can think of this as being a continuum of things from propaganda to psychological operations and warfare to advertising or even education, at a more benevolent range of the continuum. And so these are just some related concepts of, from propaganda through advertising. You hear a lot about social engineering, and the first time we talked about this at a conference, people said, well, isn't this just social engineering that you're talking about? So we tried to come up with this example of saying that, yes, there's some overlap, but really we're looking at something slightly different at least. So often in social engineering, somebody is trying to trick you into giving you a password or social security number, for identity theft, or just logging on to a computer system under your identity. And so that people have done studies where they offer a free ballpoint pen in exchange for the password or something like that, and the people often comply with that. But what we're more interested in is not just tricking somebody to get the password, but rather something where the computer system itself is used as an instrument of conveying that message to get the user to take some action. And I'll go into more detail about a typical example we looked at, which was a pump and dump scheme. And this is a scheme where someone's trying to manipulate the price of a company's stock, say by posting misleading postings in a discussion group on the web. And as a result of that, people will buy or sell a stock, and the person perpetrating the fraud can make a profit on that. And so this is just sort of graphically representing Libicki's sort of taxonomy of physical attack, something just literally destroying the hardware, versus syntactic attacks, which you can think of as most of the sort of traditional areas of computer security, the things like viruses and worms and denial of service and so on. And semantic attacks, on the other hand, being things more like misinformation or maybe website defacement, spoofing, and so on. And another related area is information warfare or information operations in a military setting. So one very traditional definition in computer security that was stated in this 1981 paper by Carl Landwehr is information contained in an automated system must be protected from three kinds of threats: the unauthorized disclosure of information, the unauthorized modification of information, and the unauthorized withholding of information. Also sometimes called confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. And this definition originally came out in the context of sort of multiple classification level message handling systems. And in today's sort of web environment, e-commerce and so on, in a lot of ways, and many of the examples we'll talk about here, they don't really violate any of these sort of three threats. So, things have changed in some ways in terms of what we would consider sort of semantic, kind of attacks. So the definition we ultimately came up with in this project for cognitive or semantic hacking was a networked information system attack that relies on changing human users' perceptions and corresponding behaviors in order to be successful. So unlike much of social engineering, it requires the use of the information system itself to convey the attack, not just something that you take advantage of once you've done the social engineering to access the system. And it also requires the user to change behavior, which isn't necessarily true for worms and viruses and so on. And all of this is exploiting our growing reliance on being increasingly networked with various information sources. So as a concrete example of this kind of pump and dump scheme I mentioned, in November '99, two UCLA graduate students and one other collaborator purchased nearly all of the shares of a bankrupt company, NEI Web World. And then they posted many messages in an internet message board to try to pump up the value of the stock, and they also pretended to be a company interested in acquiring this bankrupt company. And as a result of this, in one day, the value of the stock increased from 13 cents a share to $15 a share, and they quickly made $364,000. But they were caught, and in December '99, they were charged by the SEC and later sentenced to some time in jail, and they had to give up all their profits. Another very well-known case involved a teenager, middle school, I believe, student in New Jersey, Jonathan Levitt, who did similar manipulations, but each time made large profits. But one of the interesting things about this case was, even though the SEC was very interested in prosecuting him, they eventually settled out of court, and he was allowed to keep about $500,000 of his earnings, because it was a very gray area of the law. So in some way, he could say that what he was doing wasn't that different from some kind of stock professional that's just giving advice on the internet, despite the fact that he was 13 or 14 years old at the time he started doing it. But maybe this font's a little too small to read, but an example of the kind of thing he'd post is like the FTEC is starting to break out. Next week this thing will explode. Currently it's trading for just 2.5. I'm expecting to see 20 very soon. Let me explain why, and so on and so on. And so this is actually fairly mild writing style compared to some of these I've seen. But in any case, interestingly, the New York Times Magazine and various other, there's a book that was sort of half about this. There's been a lot written about this, and it turns out that not only were his classmates, but even some of the teachers at his school were all getting in on this when he was doing these kind of things. So it was sort of an interesting case. Another example was Emulex, where Mark Jacob had shorted these shares in Emulex, but the stock rose, and so he lost money. And so he, I guess, had formerly worked at this Internet Wire, and he still had an account there. He sent out a false press release claiming that this corporation was being investigated by the SEC, being forced to restate 1998-99 earnings, and as a result of this manipulation, made $236,000. So there is sort of economic perspective to these kind of manipulations, and you can tie this into work in software agents, or even economics work on theory of the firm. And so one of the things we were looking at was value of information. So in one of these, imagine you're a day trader and you see one of these news postings. And if this is valid, sort of true, reliable information, it's very important to act on it the second you see it and make a huge profit. But if somebody's manipulating your perception, you could lose everything by that quick action. So what we were trying to come up with were countermeasures that, someone in this situation might be able to, very quickly get some sense to whether this information was reliable or not, before acting. But on the other hand, the longer you delay, the longer it takes to, confirm that information, the more you potentially, the less your profit would be. So just as in the BattleSpace that Libicki talked about, as systems are becoming more and more automated, and you're relying on information from various sensor networks and so on, just in the modern firm, there's more and more automation, and it's much easier to manipulate that information flow through misinformation. And one example of this was an exercise that Dartmouth and some other agencies were involved with called Livewire, where there was a simulated attack by an adversary on the U.S. economy as a kind of cyber warfare